Riona pressed her spine against the cold stone pillar and listened to the crowd decide whether she would live. The great hall of Ashenvale had been dressed for a wedding. White flowers hung from the iron chandeliers in bundles thick enough to block the candlelight, and the scent of them, sweet, almost rotting, settled over everything like a second skin. 300 wolves in their finest clothes stood in tiered rows along the gallery above. And 300 more filled the floor below, and every single one of them was watching her, not with the soft attention of guests, with the hard, waiting attention of a crowd that has already decided something and is simply waiting for the ceremony of it to begin. She had been brought here as a bride. She understood now, standing in the center of the hall in a dress the color of winter cream, that she had been brought here as something else entirely. The dress was the wrong kind of beautiful. It was too fine for a woman of her bloodline. A border wolf, a Riona Voss, daughter of a pack so small and so far from the political center of Ashenvale that no one in this room would have known her name 8 weeks ago. The fabric was silk imported from the Eastern Territories. The embroidery at the collar was silver thread, the same silver used for matings between great houses. Someone had dressed her in a costume and placed her on a stage, and only now, as she pressed her back against the pillar and counted the faces turning toward the dais, did she understand the full shape of what had been constructed around her. King Aldrich Vane stood at the head of the hall with his sword still sheathed at his hip and his expression as readable as carved stone. He was 38 years old and had ruled the Ashenvale territory for 11 years, and in that time she had heard exactly 2 things about him: that he was fair, and that he was ruthless in the specific and narrow sense that fair men sometimes are, when fairness runs out. He had not looked at her once since she entered. The man who had looked at her, who had not stopped looking at her since the moment she stepped through the great doors 20 minutes ago, was Councillor Marin Dash. He stood 3 feet to the king's left with his hands folded in front of him, and a small satisfied expression arranged on his face. And Riona had been watching that expression for the past 20 minutes. The way you watch a fire you cannot put out. She knew Marin Dash. She had known him for 8 weeks, which was exactly as long as this had been happening to her. He was the one who had arrived at the border settlement with the king's seal and the offer that had felt at the time like a miracle, a royal bonding, a mating between the Voss line and the Vane throne. Her father, who was 61 years old and whose pack numbered fewer than 40, and who had spent his entire life being overlooked by the great houses, had wept when he read the letter. Actual tears. She had watched them fall onto the paper and thought, something is wrong here. She had thought it the way you think things you are not yet brave enough to say out loud. She had said yes anyway, because that is what you do when a king sends for you and your family has 40 wolves, and a crumbling border claim and a sister who needs a healer they cannot afford. You say yes, and you get in the carriage, and you wear the dress, and you walk through the doors when they open, and then you stand in the center of the great hall and listen to the crowd decide whether you will live. Councillor Dash cleared his throat. The sound, carried in the stone room with the particular authority of a man who had practiced this kind of moment. The assembly has gathered, he said, to witness the formal verification of the Voss bond claim. Verification. She turned the word over in her mind, the way you turn a stone over and look at what lives underneath. She had been told the ceremony today was a presentation, a formal introduction of the bonded pair before the territorial lords. She had been told it was customary. She had been told many things by Marin Dash over 8 weeks, in letters written in a careful, reassuring hand that she now recognized as the handwriting of someone who had written many such letters to many such women, and knew exactly how much reassurance was required to keep them moving forward. The claim, Dash continued, was registered under seal of the Vane Royal House and the Voss border settlement, with the full consent of the border alpha, Siren Voss. He paused. What has come to the attention of the council in the intervening weeks is that the bond itself may be irregular. The crowd did not gasp. That was the thing that told her how carefully this had been prepared. A crowd that gasps is surprised. A crowd that holds a collective, weighted silence has been briefed. Irregular. She understood now. She understood the way you understand something that has been true for weeks, and simply hasn't had a word yet. She was not here to be presented as a bride. She was here to be examined as a fraudulent one. Aldrich Vane had still not looked at her. Riona's hands were steady at her sides. She had learned, growing up in a border settlement where the other packs pressed in on 3 sides and weakness was an invitation, to keep her hand still when her heart was doing anything other than resting. Her heart right now was doing something complicated and rapid behind her ribs, and her hands were perfectly, deliberately still. She thought, I have done nothing wrong, she thought. That will not matter to this room, she thought. There are children in this hall. That last thought arrived in a different register than the others. Not as calculation but as physical fact, because she had noticed them when she came in. 2 boys, perhaps 6 and 8 years old, seated in the carved wooden chairs just below the dais. They were too young to be territorial lords. They were too young, really, to be at a ceremony of any kind, and they were sitting with the particular rigid stillness of children who have been told to behave or face consequences. One of them, the smaller one, had his hands twisted together in his lap. She had thought at the time, someone's children, brought to witness a royal occasion and not fully understanding what they're witnessing. She understood now that they were the king's sons. She did not yet understand why that mattered. But it lodged in her chest beside everything else she was holding, and she kept her hand still, and she waited. Dash was speaking again. He had produced a document from somewhere inside his robes and was reading from it, in the measured, unhurried tone of someone who has ensured that the outcome of this reading is already settled. The bond claim, he said, had been investigated by the council's spiritual office. The investigation had found anomalies. The bond mark. Riona touched her left wrist without thinking, where the mark had appeared the night she'd agreed to the mating, in a ceremony conducted by Dash's own representative. The bond mark was, the spiritual office believed, produced by a ritual that had not been fully consented to by the royal party. He meant Aldrich. He meant that Aldrich Vane had not consented to this bond. She stood very still in the center of the great hall, in her borrowed dress, and understood that she had been used as an instrument. That Marin Dash had forged a royal bond claim using her name and her family's desperation, and a ritual conducted in the dark of a border settlement, 300 miles from this room, and that the man who would pay for the forgery, in the eyes of this assembly, was not Dash. It was her. She was the bride who had forced a bond on a king. The crowd understood this. She could feel it in the quality of the silence around her. Not hostile, not yet, but banked and ready. The way silence gets when it is about to become something else. 300 wolves in fine clothes who had been told, in one way or another, before they walked through these doors tonight, that they were here to witness the exposure of a fraud. An ambitious border wolf who had conspired to bind herself to a king. She pressed her spine harder against the pillar. The pillar was the wrong thing to lean on. It was a decorative column, not structural, and it was slightly uneven at her shoulder, and the discomfort of it was the only thing she was entirely certain was real in this room right now. She did not look at Aldrich Vane. She looked at Marin Dash and she counted. She had 8 weeks of letters. She had 8 weeks of conversations. She had 8 weeks of watching a man manage a narrative. And she had been watching him do it, and she had not been idle. This is the thing about growing up in a border settlement that presses in on 3 sides. You learn to see what's coming before it arrives. You learn to think about exits. Not because you are a coward. She had never been a coward. Not once in 29 years. But because you learn early that waiting until a threat has arrived means you are already too late. She had been preparing for this since the 3rd week. She did not know she had been preparing for this until this moment, standing in the center of the hall. But there it was. 3 weeks into this arrangement, something had shifted in her chest. Not suspicion exactly, something quieter and older. An instinct that had sat in her sternum and watched Dash's letters arrive with their careful reassurances and thought, keep everything. Keep every letter. Keep every conversation you can. Write down what you know and what you've seen and date it and keep it somewhere no one will look. She had done that. The letters were in a leather folio in her traveling case, which was currently in the room she had been given in the East Wing. She had expected, foolishly, to return to that room tonight, as a woman who had been formally introduced to the pack. The folio was not in this room. This was the problem she had. It was a significant problem, and she was thinking about it with the particular clarity that arrives sometimes in moments of complete crisis, when the noise drops away, and you can see the shape of things very precisely. She could speak. She could tell this room what she knew. She could tell them that Dash had orchestrated this, that the bond had been performed by his representative, not a neutral officiant, that the letters he had sent described the king's direct, enthusiastic consent to the arrangement in language that was either the truth or a forgery, that she had questions too about how a royal bond claim was registered without the knowledge of the king himself. She could raise every question she had been carrying for 5 weeks and place them in the center of this room and see what the assembly did with them. She understood that if she did that right now, without her folio, without evidence, the assembly would see a desperate woman trying to talk her way out of a fraud charge. She understood that she had a very narrow window before Dash finished reading, and the crowd moved from weighted silence into something she could not recover from. And then, before she could finish calculating, everything changed. The doors at the far end of the hall flew open. Not the ceremonial doors, those were the great double doors she had entered through, carved with the territorial sigils of Ashenvale. These were the side doors, the ones she had noticed without noting when she came in, tucked behind the western gallery. And through them came noise, not crowd noise, not ceremony noise, but the specific high-pitched noise of children in panic, running footsteps, and behind that something heavier. 3 wolves came through the side doors in human form, but barely. She could see the shift trembling under their skin, the way a person looks when they are holding the change back by sheer will and losing ground. They were not in fine clothes. They were in working clothes, dark and stained, and then the one in front was bleeding from a gash on his forearm and shouting something to the room that it took her a half-second to understand. The East Wing, he was shouting. The East is breached. The Cubs. And Riona was already moving. She did not think about the assembly. She did not think about Dash, or the document he was still holding, or the particular quality of the silence that had just shattered into screaming movement around her. She did not think about the pillar she had been leaning against, or the dress she was wearing, or the fact that she was the most politically vulnerable person in this room and had just made herself visible by running toward a crisis instead of away from it. She thought, those boys were in the front, below the dais. She thought, where are they now? The hall had erupted. 300 wolves in fine clothes are still 300 wolves, and when a room like this breaks open, it breaks fast and hard. People were moving in every direction. The gallery above was emptying. The lords below were shouting to their guards. Somewhere to her left something fell and broke. The boys were gone from their chairs. She pushed through the crowd without stopping to excuse herself or navigate politely, using her shoulders and the sheer directed force of someone who grew up in a settlement, where you learned to move through chaos or get swallowed by it. She could smell the shift in the air, the particular sharpness that meant wolves were changing, somewhere near, and she could smell something under that, deeper and older, that made every hair on her body stand up. Not a pack rival, not a territorial dispute, something from the forest. Something that had come through the east wing of a palace built on the edge of wild territory, and breached it, and was still inside. She found the first boy near the base of the dais stairs. He was 8 years old and he had pressed himself behind the carved throne chair's base, and he was completely silent, which is what children do when they are past screaming, when the animal brain has taken over and told them to be small and still and silent. His eyes found her and he went even stiller, because she was a stranger and strangers were not safe. My name is Riona, she said, dropping to a crouch in front of him. I'm not going to hurt you. Where is your brother? He stared at her. The other boy, she said. Smaller than you. He was sitting right next to you. Where did he go? The boy's jaw worked. He ran, he said finally. He went toward the back, toward the doors that led to the east wing. She had the older boy by the wrist. Not rough, just certain. The grip her older cousin had used on her when she was small and in danger, and needed to know exactly where the safe person was, and she was pulling him back toward the dais. There was a recess behind the dais. She had noticed it when she came in, a narrow alcove where the official documents were stored. Small, stone-walled. Exactly the kind of place you put a child when something is coming. In there, she told him. You stay in there and you don't come out until someone you know tells you it is safe. Yes? He was staring at her with eyes that were amber and old even at 8. Yes, he said, good. She pressed him into the alcove and turned and ran. The crowd had thinned enough that she could move faster now. The great hall was still chaos, but a directed chaos. Guards pouring in from the main entrance. Wolves in partial shift spreading toward the perimeter. She could see Dash near the far wall, his carefully arranged expression completely gone, replaced with something that looked like genuine fear, which told her the thing in the east wing was not something he had orchestrated. She pushed through the side door. The corridor beyond was darker. The sconces had been knocked out or extinguished, she couldn't tell which, and the light came only from the windows along the outer wall, and there was very little moon tonight. She could smell the forest smell stronger here, and under it something metallic that she identified a half-second later as blood. Not the guard's blood from the gash she'd seen. Something older. Something spilled here in this corridor before anyone came to raise the alarm, and then she heard the sound. A child crying. Not the lost, helpless crying of a child who has given up. The sharp, contained crying of a child who is trying not to cry and failing at it, which is somehow worse. She followed it. The sound came from a doorway halfway down the corridor, and the doorway led to a room that was. She registered details fast, the way she'd learned in 29 years of watching Edges. A receiving room of some kind, a formal space with draped furniture, and a cold fireplace and a window that had been broken inward. The glass was on the floor inside the room. Whatever had come through the east wing had come through this window, and it was still in this room. She knew before she saw it. The smell confirmed it, that deep, old smell that was not any wolf she had ever scented, not any creature she had a name for, something that lived in the territory between what the pack called natural and what the pack called other. The smaller boy, 6 years, she thought, maybe younger, was backed into the corner beside the cold fireplace with his knees pulled up and his face buried in his arms, and he was crying that contained terrible crying, and the creature near the broken window was watching him. She saw it clearly in the thin moonlight for exactly 2 seconds before she processed what she was looking at. Tall, narrow, the shape of a wolf but not quite, the way a shadow is not quite the thing that casts it, eyes that caught light in a way that wolf eyes don't. Something wrong about the angle of the hind legs. Something wrong about the way it breathed, which was too slow, too deliberate, the way things breathe when they are choosing their moment. Riona walked through the doorway. This is the other thing that growing up on a border teaches you. Not courage. Courage implies you have considered the alternative and rejected it. This was something different. This was the knowledge, bone deep and not entirely rational, that the space between a predator and a child is a space that must be filled by something, and she was the something that was here. She planted herself between the creature and the boy. She was not in wolf form. She was in a silk wedding dress with embroidered silver at the collar. And she was standing between whatever this thing was and a 6-year-old who was crying. And she was very still, and she was thinking about what she had. She had her voice, she had her body. She had the bond mark on her left wrist, which had been burning since she entered this rescount, which had been burning in fact since the doors blew open in the great hall, burning in a way that the mark had not burned since the night it was placed, and she had been ignoring it the way you ignore something you don't have time for right now. She stopped ignoring it. The mark on her wrist was, by Dash's account, fraudulent, by the council's spiritual office, irregular, by every legal and political calculation in that great hall, evidence of a crime she had committed against a king. By the mark itself, by the heat of it against her pulse point, by the way it had been burning steadily since she'd moved toward those doors, it was real. Real bonds had properties. She had grown up in a border settlement far from the politics of royal bonds, but she had not grown up ignorant, and she knew that a real bond between a true pair was not merely a marking. It was a tether. It was a channel. It was in some circumstances something you could push through. She pressed the mark against her palm and she pushed, not with thought. You cannot think a bond open the way you think a door open. You push with the thing underneath thought, the thing that is older than calculation, that lives where the wolf lives when you are in human form, the thing that had been quiet in her for 29 years, because there had been nothing in her life significant enough to wake it. She felt it open like a seam, and through it came something she had no word for. Not power exactly, not the shift. Something steadier and stranger. A warmth that started at the mark and moved up her arm to her chest and settled there, and the creature in front of her stilled. It was looking at her differently. She understood, in the particular wordless way you understand things that happen in the body before they reach language, that, whatever this thing was, it recognized what was happening. It recognized the bond. It had perhaps even come here because of the bond, because a royal bond violated, performed in darkened deception, is a wound in the spiritual geography of a territory, and things that live in the spaces between light and dark are drawn to wounds. She did not move. Leave, she said. She did not say it loudly. She said it the way you say something to a creature that hears you in the register below sound. The way she had said things to the wolves along the border when she was young and they came in too close, and her father was not there. Quiet, certain, not a request. The creature looked at her for 4 seconds, then it turned. It went back through the broken window the way it had come. Not quickly, not in flight, but with the deliberate, unhurried movement of something that has made a choice. She watched the darkness of the grounds outside swallow it. And then she stood in the broken glass room and let out a breath that had been waiting a very long time. The boy in the corner had gone completely silent. She turned around. He was looking at her from over the tops of his knees. Enormous dark eyes, a face that was very young and very frightened and had just watched something she could not fully name. His hair was standing up on the left side from where he had pressed it into the wall. "It's gone," she said. He did not move. You're safe, she said. I promise you. He stared at her for another moment. Then he unfolded himself from the corner and crossed the room and pressed his face against her waist, which she had not been expecting, and she put her hand on top of his head and stood there in the ruined silk dress in the dark, glass-strewn room and held him. She heard the boots in the corridor before she heard the voice. There were many sets of boots. Guards, she thought, and possibly. She felt it through the bond mark before she heard him, a warmth that was different from what she had pushed through it herself, something coming from the other direction. Coming toward her, Aldrich Vane appeared in the doorway. He was alone, which surprised her. Or not entirely alone. There were guards in the corridor behind him. She could hear them. But he had come through the door without waiting, which was not, she thought, how a man who used other people for shields typically behaved. He was in the fine clothes he'd worn in the great hall. But the collar was open, and there was a sword in his hand that was not sheathed, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not read. Not the carved stone blankness from the hall. Something else. Something that had been startled into visibility. He looked at his son. The boy turned around from her waist and looked at his father. His lip was trembling in the specific way of children who have been very brave for as long as they can manage, and are about to stop being brave. Cavan, the king said, and crossed the room and picked him up, which was the action of a man and not a king, and something she filed carefully in the back of her mind. He held the boy against his shoulder for a moment. Just a moment, with his eyes closed, and the sword was still in his other hand, and she stood exactly where she was and did not speak. Then he opened his eyes and he looked at her. She had expected many things about what Aldrich Vane might look like when he finally looked at her. She had constructed several versions of this in 8 weeks of preparation: cold, dismissive, contemptuous, politically neutral. She had not expected what she saw, which was a man in the process of revising something very quickly, with the particular expression of someone who is good at revising quickly and does not enjoy having to. The other boy, he said. Behind the dais, she said. I put him in the document alcove. He's safe. Something moved through his face. You put him there? Yes. Before you came here? Yes. He looked at the broken window, and then at the floor. The glass, she realized the pattern of the glass, which told anyone who could read a room that the window had been broken from outside coming in. He looked at the mark on her wrist, which was still warm, which she had lowered to her side but not hidden. He looked at it for a long moment. The creature, he said. Gone, she said. Through the window. I don't know where. What did you do? She considered how to answer this. Not the simplest answer, which was, I used the bond. Because the bond was the center of the charge against her, unmatched. And she was still in the great hall politically, even if she was standing here physically. And she did not know yet which way this man was going to move. I stood between it and your son, she said, and I told it to leave. And it did. And it did. Aldrich looked at her for a long time, with Cavan still pressed against his shoulder, and the sword still in his other hand, and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away. The bond mark was very warm. I should say something about Dash. I should say it now, while I have his attention, while there is something he has just seen that he cannot explain away, she thought. Not yet, she thought. Let him look at me. Let him decide what he is looking at before I tell him what he's looking at. Men who have been given a version of events too quickly very rarely revise it. Men who have been allowed to arrive at a different understanding themselves hold it differently. She had learned that on the border too. He lowered the sword. He did not sheath it. He simply lowered it, which was not surrender but was something, and he said, Bring her, to the guards in the corridor, in a tone that was not unkind. She had expected to be taken to a cell. She was taken instead to a private study on the upper floor of the palace, a room full of maps and stacked papers, and a cold fireplace nobody had lit, and she sat in a wooden chair that was not comfortable, and waited and watched the doorway and thought about what she was going to say. He came 20 minutes later. He had given the boy to someone. She could hear Cavan in the corridor, reassured now, the high, bright voice of a young child who has been frightened and then rescued, reporting his adventure with the particular drama of the very young. He'd gotten the other boy from the alcove as well. She heard that too. The older one's voice, calmer and more contained. She listened to both of them until the voices moved away down the corridor, and then Aldrich came in and closed the door. He did not have the sword anymore. He had a glass of something he set on the edge of the paper-covered desk, and he did not offer her one, which she noted without surprise. He looked at her with the same expression she had catalogued in the dark room, the revising expression, but slower now, more deliberate. The bond mark, he said. Yes, she said. The council's report says the ritual was conducted without my consent. I know what the report says. I did not, he said, very evenly, consent to a bond with you, Riona Voss. I want you to understand that I am saying this as plainly as I know how. I know, she said. I didn't consent to a bond with you either. The pause that followed was careful. You were told, she said. I imagined that I came here with the intention of manufacturing a false bond to secure a royal connection for my family's benefit. Marindash told you this, or had someone tell you this, before tonight. Another pause. Smaller. He told you something that explained why you should look at me as guilty before I had the opportunity to speak, she said. He is good at that. He spent 8 weeks managing what I believed, and he is very good at it. I imagine he spent somewhat less time managing what you believe, because he knows you better and requires less setup. Aldrich picked up his glass and looked at it and didn't drink. He came to my border settlement 8 weeks ago, she said, with your seal on a letter. The letter described a royal bond offer. It described your personal interest in a connection with the border settlements along the western edge of the territory. It described your direct statement that you had found, through the spiritual registry, a potential bond pair in the Voss line. She paused. I have the letter. I have 7 more like it. I have a record of every conversation I had with his representative, written in my own hand and dated, beginning from the 3rd week, when I understood that something about this arrangement was wrong. He was very still. The ritual, she said, was conducted by a man who identified himself as the king's sworn officiant. I did not know then that this was a lie. I know it now, because a sworn royal officiant does not conduct a bond ceremony in the back room of a border settlement at 2 a.m, with no witnesses beyond the officiant himself and a representative of the council. I know that now. I should have known it then. Why didn't you stop it, he said. Because my family has 40 wolves and a border claim and a sister who needs a healer they cannot afford, she said. And you offered a lifeline, and I took it, and I am not ashamed of that. I am telling you what actually happened. He looked at her. Really looked at her. In a way he had not done in the great hall, in a way that took in the totality of her sitting in his uncomfortable chair, in a ruined silk dress, with glass dust still on her shoes and a warm bond mark on her wrist. What do you want? He said. Right now. My folio, she said. It's in my traveling case in the East Wing room. I would like someone to retrieve it before it's disturbed. Something moved through his expression that might, under very different circumstances, have been the beginning of something she didn't have a word for yet. And after the folio, he said. After the folio, she said. I want to sit across a table from Marindash with your counsel, with witnesses, and I want to ask him some questions, in public, with documentation. You want a formal inquiry. I want the truth in a room where it cannot be ignored, she said. Which is what I came here in the first place before tonight taught me what I was actually walking into. He was quiet for a long moment. The creature, he said, the one you sent through the window, you used the bond to do it. I used what I had, she said. The bond between a fraudulent pair doesn't carry power, he said. The spiritual office made that very clear in their report. A manufactured bond has no resonance. It cannot be pushed through. It cannot be used to compel a spirit creature of the territory. She held his eyes. No, she agreed. It cannot. The silence in the room was a different quality now. It had weight. It had the specific texture of something that had been called by its right name for the first time and was settling into the shape of that name. He looked at her wrist. She did not hide it. A real bond, he said quietly, and it was not entirely a question. I don't know what it is, she said. I know what it did tonight. I know what it has felt like for 8 weeks, which was not what I expected a manufactured mark to feel like. But I told myself what we all tell ourselves when we are explaining away the thing we don't want to look at directly. He said nothing. I would like my folio, she said, and I would like the inquiry, and I would like. She paused and took a breath and let herself say the thing she had been carrying the longest. I would like it on the record, formally, publicly, that I did not come here to deceive you. Whatever else happens, I would like that to be known. He crossed the room and set the glass down on the mantelpiece rather than the desk, a small displacement that told her he was thinking. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and she did not fill the silence, because she had said what she had to say, and anything more would be arguing, and she was done arguing with rooms tonight. Your folio, he said, will be retrieved. She released a breath. Dash will be called before the full council, he said. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight, while the East Wing is still breached, and the spirit creature is still unaccounted for, because those things are connected, and I want to know how. He turned. You will be present. Yes, she said. He looked at her for one more moment. You ran toward my sons, he said, not away. Yes, why? She thought about this. Not the answer she could perform. There were several of those available, polished and clean. She thought about the actual reason, which was simpler and stranger. Because they were scared, she said, and I was the only one near enough. He held her gaze for a count of 3. Then he left to retrieve the counsel, and she sat in the quiet study and pressed her wrist against her palm, and the mark was steady and warm and very real. The council chamber was smaller than the great hall and brighter. Every candle lit, the overhead chandeliers blazing, a long rectangular table with 12 seats, and a 13th brought in for her at one end. Dash sat at the other end with the document he'd been reading from the hall still in his hands, and she could see from across the length of the table that his composure had been rebuilt since the hall. Carefully, quickly, the composure of a man who has faced councils before and knows how to face them again. She had faced nothing like this before in her life. She was aware of that. She was aware of it the way you are aware of standing at the edge of something with a long drop, when the awareness is useful and the thing you must not do is look down. Her folio was on the table in front of her. The guard had brought it undisturbed, still tied, with the cord. She had knotted herself in a particular pattern she would have been able to tell, if disturbed. It had not been disturbed. Aldrich sat at the center of the long side of the table, not at the head, the territorial arrangement, she realized. This was not a royal decree. This was a council proceeding, and he was placing himself within it rather than above it, which told her something important about how he expected this to go. 11 council members, 9 men, 2 women, all of them looking at her, then at Dash, then at the folio. Aldrich said, "Councillor Dash, you organized and officiated the bond claim between the Voss border settlement and this house. Is that correct?" Dash said, "I organized it, yes, on behalf of the Crown, pursuant to the spiritual registry's identification of a potential royal pair." His voice was very smooth. "It is standard practice for the council to manage the preliminary arrangements of a royal bond to spare the Crown the administrative burden." "Who commissioned the registry search?" Aldrich said. A pause. Microseconds only, but she caught it. "The registry conducts ongoing assessments," Dash said. "It is standard practice." "Who commissioned the search that found the Voss line?" Aldrich said with precisely the same intonation. The woman to Aldrich's left leaned forward slightly. She was perhaps 50, silver-streaked hair, a face that had spent a long time watching other people speak and measuring what they were not saying. "I would like to know," this woman said, "whether the king's personal consent to this bond claim was sought before the letters were sent to the border settlement." Dash looked at her. "The king's consent to a bond is implicit in the registry designation." "Is it?" said the woman. She looked at Aldrich. "No," said Aldrich. The silence that followed was the kind that turns things. Riona opened her folio. She had organized it carefully over 8 weeks. In the evenings, after she had finished doing whatever was asked of her in preparation for a wedding, she understood less every week. She had organized it the way her father had taught her to organize anything you might someday need to defend. Chronologically, with dates, with the names of everyone present at every relevant conversation, and with a separate section at the back for things she could not yet explain but had noted anyway. "The first letter," she said, "was delivered to my father's settlement on the 12th of February. It carries the royal seal. I believe the council should look at the seal very carefully, because I am not a documents expert. But in the 6th week, I had occasion to see a letter that did carry the king's verified seal, on official council correspondence to a border dispute hearing, and there is a difference in the inner ring of the impression." She slid the letter to the woman on her left, who passed it down. "The 3rd letter," she said, "describes in direct language a conversation the king had with his spiritual advisor about the bond pair identification. It quotes the king directly. I would be interested to know if the king recalls having this conversation." She looked at Aldrich. "I do not," he said. "That is what I expected," she said. She passed the 3rd letter. She worked through the folio methodically, without haste. 12 letters. 6 dated notes of conversations. 3 entries in her own record of things she had been told by Dash's representative that had subsequently proven false upon her arrival at the palace. Details about the layout of the palace, about who held which council positions, about the king's known preferences and practices, all of which she had been given as evidence of the king's personal involvement in this arrangement, and all of which had been subtly, specifically wrong in ways that only became apparent once she arrived. She had not known why those details were wrong until she was standing in the great hall tonight and understanding the shape of what Dash had built. The false details were not mistakes. They were evidence that the person providing them had not access to the actual king. They were evidence that the version of Aldrich Vane she had been given across 8 weeks was a constructed version, assembled by someone who needed her to believe in a man's enthusiasm for this arrangement, and did not actually have access to that man's enthusiasm. Dash was very still across the length of the table. In the third week, she said, I asked Dash's representative why the arrangement required such secrecy. I was told that the king preferred to manage royal bond arrangements quietly, to prevent speculation among the territorial houses. I was told this was a known preference, well established. She paused. I am asking this council whether the king has ever expressed such a preference. 11 faces turned toward Aldrich. I have not, he said. I am asking this council, said, whether Marandash has access to the spiritual registry, and whether a council member may commission a registry search independently. The silver-haired woman said very quietly, he does. And they may. Without the king's knowledge. A pause. Without the king's prior knowledge, yes. Searches is disclosed quarterly. And when was the last quarterly disclosure? Another pause. Longer this time. January, said one of the male council members, not looking at Dash. The January disclosure would have preceded a February initiation. She closed the folio. I did not come here to forge a bond, she said. I came here because a man with access to the royal seal and the spiritual registry and the administrative apparatus of this council decided that a connection between the Voss line and the Vane throne served his purposes in some way I do not yet fully understand, and I was the instrument he chose for it, and I want to know why. She looked at Dash. I have 8 weeks of documentation. I imagine this council has resources I do not. I would like those resources applied to that question. Dash looked at her across the length of the table. For the first time tonight, she saw something in his face that was not management. It was the expression of a man who had built an elaborate mechanism and is watching a part of it he had not accounted for do something unexpected. She looked back at him steadily. Why, she said to him directly, quietly enough that it was almost private. Did you need the king bonded to a border wolf? Said nothing. Because that is the question, she said. Not whether I am guilty of fraud. I am not. You know I am not, and in the next several days this council will know it too. The question is why you needed a bond claim attached to the Vane throne that the king himself did not initiate. Who does that serve? What does a false royal bond accomplish for the man who arranged it? She felt the room shift, felt the 12 council members revising, individually and collectively, the story they had walked into this chamber with, felt Aldrich, at the center of the long side of the table, go very still in a way that was not the stillness of a man withholding judgment. The silver-haired woman said, a contested bond claim, if the original claim stood, would give the council's spiritual office final authority over its resolution. A beat. Final authority, said another council member, slowly. Over a royal matter resolved by the spiritual office would require a spiritual office review of the crown's succession arrangements, said the silver-haired woman. If the bond was deemed irregular, if the bond were contested without resolution, the spiritual office has jurisdictional authority over succession disputes arising from. She stopped. She was looking at Dash. Who controls the spiritual office? Said Aldrich. The room was completely silent. I chair the spiritual oversight committee, said Dash, in a tone that had lost its smoothness entirely. It was flat now, the flat tone of a calculation that has been found out. You arranged a false royal bond claim, said Aldrich, that you intended to contest through the council's spiritual office, which you chair, to trigger a succession review of the Vane throne. Dash said nothing. My sons, said Aldrich very quietly, and the quiet of it was worse than raised voices would have been. She watched Dash make the decision she had seen people make, at the border, at the edge of things, when there is nowhere left to go. The decision to stop constructing a way out and simply wait to see what comes. He said nothing. The spirit creature, she said. In the east wing. It came through a broken window. Who broke the window? Dash looked at her. A real bond, she said, casts a resonance through the territory. If you knew the bond was real, if the registry search actually found a true pair, not a manufactured one, then you knew that the bond's existence activated would draw what lives in the edges of this territory toward the palace, toward the bond, toward the people connected to it. She paused. The king's sons are connected to the king. The king is connected to the bond. You arranged for the bond to be activated tonight, in the ceremony, in front of the court, and you knew what would come. She heard one of the council members make a sound. Not to kill them, she said, still looking at Dash. Not necessarily, but to create an incident. A supernatural incident within the palace walls on the night of a contested bond claim, while the spiritual office's authority to intervene was already being invoked. An incident that would demonstrate the instability of an unauthorized bond. An incident that would require the spiritual office to step in. She paused. With the king's children involved, the pressure on him to accept the spiritual office's jurisdiction would be Significant. Dash looked at the table. The spirit creature leaving tonight was not your plan, she said. That was not supposed to happen. It was supposed to stay in the palace long enough to cause exactly the kind of crisis your succession review required. She held the bond mark against her palm. You did not account for the bond being real, she thought, in the small private place behind her eyes, about standing in a dark room in a silk dress, telling something ancient and territorial to leave, about the warmth moving up her arm, about a 6-year-old boy pressing his face against her waist. She thought, I did not plan any of this. Not a single moment of this night, she thought, and yet here I am. Aldrich rose from his seat. He moved to the end of the table where Dash sat, and he stood there, and the quality of what he was holding was visible even across the room. A controlled fury, the specific fury of a man who has spent 11 years building something and has just understood precisely how close someone came to dismantling it through the bodies of his children. He did not touch Dash. He did not raise his voice. Remove him from this chamber, he said to the guards at the door. Detain him in the lower rooms pending a full formal inquiry. Every record his office holds is sealed as of this moment. No correspondence leaves this palace tonight. He stood while the guards moved to comply, while Dash rose from his chair with the flat, emptied expression of a man who has used up everything he has, and walked out of the chamber between two guards without looking at her again. The door closed. The room breathed. Riona closed the folio and set her hands on top of it and looked at the table, because she needed a moment that was not a moment anyone else was watching. She needed 30 seconds to be a woman who had just done something extraordinary and had no idea what to do next. The silver-haired woman across the table said, I want the record to note, formally and clearly, that the evidence presented by the Voss representative tonight constitutes a complete refutation of the bond fraud charge. She looked at the other council members. Does the council agree? 11 voices in varying degrees of quiet and certainty said that it did. The woman looked at Riona. The charge is withdrawn. Your name is clear. Riona looked up from the table. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steady. She had not known until this moment if it would be. She became aware, slowly, that Aldrich was still standing at the far end of the table, and that he had turned, and that he was looking at her across the length of the cleared space. The chamber was beginning to reorganize itself. The council members conferring in low voices, the guards at the door shifting. But he was very still in the center of all of it, looking at her the way he had looked at her the dark room beside the cold fireplace, with the expression of a man in the process of understanding something he had not expected to need to understand. She looked back. The bond mark on her wrist was warm in the way it had been warm since the beginning, steady, constant, the warmth of something true. She had spent 8 weeks explaining it away, and she was done explaining it. She did not know what it meant for tomorrow. She did not know what it meant for the inquiry, for her family, for the border settlement, for any of the 40 wolves in the Voss pack who were waiting for word. She did not know what a real bond between a border wolf and a territorial king meant when the bond was unasked for and unplanned, and had been born in a fraudulent ceremony, in the back room of a settlement 300 miles away. She knew what it had done tonight, she thought. That is enough to know for right now. That is enough. She gathered her folio from the table and stood, and her legs were steadier than she deserved for everything they had carried in the past several hours. And she looked at Aldrich Vane across the council chamber, and she made a decision she had not consciously made until the moment it was already made. She would not ask for anything more tonight. She would not press an advantage she technically held. She would not name the bond publicly, would not ask the council to formalize it, would not demand anything that a woman who had come here in good faith and been used as a political instrument could reasonably demand. She had cleared her name. She had given the council what it needed to understand what Dash had done. She had protected 2 children who were not hers, and would in all likelihood never fully understand what that cost her to walk into that dark room. She was going to leave this chamber and find a room to sleep in. That was not the room she'd been assigned as a bride, and in the morning she was going to ask for a carriage to take her back to the border, and she was going to go home. That was what she had decided. She was 3 steps toward the door when Aldrich said her name, not her family name, not her title such as it was. Her name, which he had only heard for the first time hours ago in a dark room where she was standing between his son and something older than both of them. Riona. She stopped. She did not turn immediately. She gave herself 1 breath, because she had learned the value of 1 breath before you turn and let someone see your face. Then she turned. He had crossed the chamber. She hadn't heard him move. Which was the wolf in him and not the king, the thing that moved without announcing itself, And he was closer than she'd expected, not arm's length, but close enough that she could see. For the first time without the hall's drama, or the dark room's shadows, or the council table's formality between them, what he actually looked like. Older than she'd imagined from his legend, tired in a way that was not tonight's tiredness but a longer kind. A man who had been holding a very large thing for a very long time, and had just learned that someone he trusted had been trying to take it from him through his sons. The bond mark on her wrist pulsed once, warm and certain. "I would like to ask you," he said, "to stay." She looked at him. "Not as a bride," he said. "Not as a council instrument. Not as a bond pair whose status requires immediate resolution." He paused. And she could see him choosing his words with the care of a man who is used to his words having consequences and has decided that precision is worth the difficulty. "I would like to ask you to stay while the inquiry runs, and while the territory is stabilized, and while I have the time to understand what the registry search actually found, and what the bond actually means, without Dash's construction of it between us." She was quiet. "I am not asking for anything," he said. "Not a decision, not an acknowledgement of what you felt through the mark tonight, not a claim. I am asking for time, in which you are not a prisoner and not a bride and not a political instrument, but a person who knows something about this territory's edges and this council's workings that I would very much like to understand better." The council chamber was almost empty behind him. The silver-haired woman was still at the table, not pretending not to watch. "My family," Riona said. "The border settlement. 40 wolves and a crumbling claim, and a sister who needs a healer." "The healer will be there by the end of the week," he said. "The border claim will be reviewed through the proper territorial process. That has nothing to do with what I'm asking you." She understood what he was doing. He was removing the conditions. He was taking away the circumstances that had made her say yes in the first place and asking her, without any of them, what she actually chose. It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had offered her in 8 weeks. She thought about her folio on the table. She thought about 40 wolves at a border. She thought about a 6-year-old boy and the warmth in her wrist, and the creature going back through a broken window, and the way this man had closed his eyes for just a moment when he picked up his son. She thought, "I came here to say yes to something I was told was already decided." She thought, "I have not said yes to anything I actually chose." She thought, "I could choose now." The bond mark on her wrist was warm and waiting and did not tell her what to do, because real bonds don't. Real bonds are not chains. They are channels. They carry what you put into them, and they are as large or as small as the willingness of the people holding them. She had been afraid of it for 8 weeks, in the back of her chest, where she kept the things she didn't look at. She was done being afraid of it. "All right," she said. The word was small and clean and entirely her own. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted in a way she filed carefully, warmly, in a place she would examine later when she had quiet and rest, and the luxury of paying attention to small things. For now she simply looked back at him, and the bond mark was warm. And the council chamber was very bright, and outside the palace windows the forest was dark and old, and full of things that recognized a true bond when they felt one. She had come here as an instrument. She stayed as herself. In the weeks that followed, as the formal inquiry into Merendash's conspiracy unfolded before the full territorial assembly, Riona Voss sat at the council table with her folio open, and her hands still, and answered every question she was asked with the particular clarity of someone who has been preparing for a room like this since the 3rd week of an 8-week deception. She did not perform outrage. She did not perform victimhood. She presented what she knew, in order, with dates, and let the documentation do what documentation does when it has been kept carefully by someone who understood that a record kept is a truth preserved. Dash had wanted to leverage the succession process through a controlled supernatural crisis. The registry search had been real. He had found her, or rather the registry had found her, because the registry does not lie even when the people using it do. And what it found was a true pair, a resonance between the Voss line and the Vane throne that was as old enough and deep enough to have survived a fraudulent ceremony and an 8-week campaign of misdirection and a night of political theater in a hall full of wolves in fine clothes. He had intended to control the crisis, deploy the bond as a weapon, use the spirit creature as a demonstration of the bond's instability, and walk away from the wreckage with the spiritual office's jurisdictional authority over the succession secured. He had not accounted for her being who she was. That was the part she found, in her quieter moments, the most interesting. Not that he had underestimated her. Many people had underestimated her over 29 years, and that was not interesting. That was simply the tax you paid for growing up small and female and far from the center of things. What was interesting was the specific way he had underestimated her. He had seen a border wolf from a struggling pack and a frightened family, and had thought, instrument. He had thought, she will go where I point her and hold still when I need her to, and not look too closely at the mechanism. He had not considered that a woman, who grows up in a place where weakness is an invitation, learns to look very closely at everything. She thought about this often in the weeks of the inquiry, in the evenings after the council sessions, when she walked the palace's upper corridors and listened to the forest outside the walls. The forest was quiet. The spirit creature had not returned, and the other things that lived in the dark territory beyond the grounds seemed to have made a decision about the palace and the bond that emanated from it and settled back into their own distances. The broken window in the east wing receiving room had been repaired, and the room itself left largely as it was, and she walked past it sometimes and thought about standing in the dark with glass under her feet, and something looking at her with eyes that caught light wrong. She thought, I have done things I did not know I could do, she thought. That is not a small thing. Kavan, the younger boy, found her 3 days after the great hall night in the upper corridor outside the library, where she had been carrying a stack of territorial law documents and had paused to shift the stack. And he had appeared from the library doorway and looked at her with his enormous dark eyes. You're the one from the dark room, he said. Yes, she said. You told the bad thing to go away. Yes. He considered this with the seriousness of a 6-year-old who is constructing a piece of very important information. How, he said. She thought about how to answer this in a way that was true and also appropriate for 6 years old. I used the thing on my wrist, she said, the mark. He looked at her wrist. He reached out with the complete lack of ceremony of very young children and touched it with one finger. It's warm, he said. I know, she said. Like a good fire, he said. Not a bad one, she looked at him. He was so young and so serious, and had been so frightened and had pressed his face against her waist with absolute trust, which is the thing that children do when they have run out of other options and which leaves a mark on the person they do it to. That is different from any other kind of mark. Yes, she said, like a good fire. He nodded as though this confirmed something and went back into the library. She stood in the corridor for a moment with the stack of law documents in her arms and the warm mark on her wrist, and something large and complicated happening in the center of her chest. The older boy, Fen, she learned, 8 years old and constitutionally incapable of the full unguarded trust his brother extended to everyone, found his own way to her more slowly, over 2 weeks, in increments. He appeared at the edges of rooms where she was. He sat at the far end of a table when she worked in the council archive. He did not speak to her for 11 days, and on the 12th day he sat down across from her while she was reviewing documents and said, My father says you knew about the council before he did. I knew some things, she said. He knew others. Together it was enough. Fen looked at her with the amber eyes that were the king's eyes made young. He doesn't usually need help, he said. She thought about how to answer this honestly, without overcomplicating it for an 8-year-old. Everybody needs help sometimes, she said. What matters is recognizing it. He was quiet for a moment. I hid behind the throne chair, he said. You told me to get in the alcove and I didn't go. Not right away. I hid behind the throne chair first. That's all right, she said. It was faster to the alcove, he said. I wasted time. She put down her pen and looked at him, because this was a child of 8 carrying something she recognized. The specific, exhausting weight of believing you should have done better in a crisis that no 8-year-old should have been in at all. You were frightened, she said, and you moved when I told you to move, and you were safe. That is all that needed to happen. He looked at her with eyes that were not entirely convinced. You will, she said, have the rest of your life to practice being braver than you think you are. Tonight was one night. Don't let one night be the whole story. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Are you staying? She held the steady warmth at her wrist. I think so, she said. Yes. The inquiry concluded at the end of the 4th week with Dash removed from the council and his spiritual oversight role dissolved, and 5 of his secondary collaborators identified and placed under territorial review. The bond claim was not dismissed. It was re-examined, formally, by the full spiritual office with 3 independent officiants from outside the territory. And they confirmed what the warmth in her wrist had been telling her since February. It was real. The council did not tell her what to do with that. Aldrich did not tell her what to do with that. He sat across from her at a table in his private study, the same study she had sat in alone on the night of the Great Hall, the cold fireplace room full of maps, and told her what the officiants had found, and then was quiet. She thought about 40 wolves at a border. She thought about her father reading a letter with tears falling on the paper. She thought about what a real bond meant for a woman who had spent 8 weeks being used as an instrument, and 4 weeks being something else. She thought about choosing. "I have conditions," she said. He looked at her without surprise. "I expected you would." "The border settlement is formalized," she said. "Not reviewed, formalized. The Voss claim is recognized territorially and the pack is no longer a border entity vulnerable to absorption." "Yes," he said. "My sister has a permanent healer's contract," she said. "Not a royal favor that can be withdrawn. A contract." "Yes, I sit on the council," she said. "Not as a queen consort role, not ceremonially. As a member with documentation authority and inquiry rights." He looked at her, something in his expression that was warm and precise and not at all surprised. "Yes," he said. And she said, "This is done slowly, whatever this is, whatever the bond is and whatever it means for both of us. It is done slowly and on terms we both agree to, and if I find at any point that I am being managed the way Dash managed me, I leave. No politics, no succession claims, no ceremony. I walk out the door." "I would not stop you," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm still at this table." He held her gaze. The fire was lit in this room tonight. Someone had finally lit it, and the light of it was on his face, and the warmth at her wrist was the same warmth she had pushed through a seam in the dark to send a spirit creature back into the forest, steady and certain in hers. "All right," he said. The same 2 words she had said to him in the council chamber, small and clean and a choice made freely, by someone who knows exactly what she is choosing. Outside the palace, the forest breathed. The territory settled into itself around a bond that had been real from the beginning. Real through every letter and every deception and every ceremony conducted in the wrong light by the wrong hands. Real in the way only the oldest things are real. Not because it was perfect, but because it was true. And the truth of it had survived everything they had put in its path, and come out the other side warm and waiting and entirely itself. She had come here as an instrument of someone else's ambition. She left that role in the great hall the moment she stopped leaning against the pillar and started running toward what was frightened and small and needed someone to stand between it and the dark, and she had been someone else entirely ever since. Someone she recognized, finally, as the person she had always been underneath the 40 wolves and the crumbling claim and the letter she should have looked at more carefully in February. Riona Voss, who had kept every letter and written down every date, and carried a folio through a fraudulent wedding into a council chamber, and dismantled a conspiracy with documentation and a steady voice, sat in a lit room across from a man who was looking at her without stone or management, or the careful blankness of someone who has decided something in advance, and she looked back at him, and the mark on her wrist was warm, and she had chosen nothing she had not freely chosen, and that was the whole of it. That was, it turned out, more than enough.